When something so horrifying happens that it seems to break language itself, what's the role of a novelist? I mean, after September 11th, 2001, as the world was just trying to process the unbelievable reality of it all, writers had to ask themselves a really profound question. Can you, and maybe more importantly, should you, try to make art out of that kind of atrocity? For the Jewish-American author Thane Rosenbaum, the answer was a hard no. He argued that the only right artistic response to a tragedy that big was a kind of collective numbness. To him, imagination just couldn't and shouldn't try to compete with what really happened. The most respectful thing an author could do? Just don't touch it. But that plea for silence, it was pretty much ignored. In the years that followed, a whole wave of fiction came out, creating what we can now call 9/11 fiction. We're talking a body of work with more than 30 novels, all wrestling with the event in some way. And that, of course, brings us to the central question for today. If you're not going to be silent, how in the world do you approach it? How did all these authors try to make art from what was still such an open wound? And what can their very different approaches tell us about the power and, the limits of fiction itself? So to help us get a handle on this, the literary critic Christian Versluis actually gives us a really useful framework. He groups this whole wave of fiction into three broad categories, which gives us a kind of map to understand the very different ways novelists tried to make sense of the senseless.
Okay, so first you have the tangential novels. In these, 9/11 is there, it's a tragic backdrop, but it's not the main event. Think of a love story that just happens to be set around the attacks. Then you've got the ideological novels, which use the event to push a specific political or religious point. And finally, you have the novels of imaginative engagement, and these are the deepest, most artistic attempts to really process the trauma. We're going to focus on those last two because that's where the most direct and complex stuff really happens.
Now, inside that second category, we find this really interesting idea called narrative fetishism. It's a bit of a mouthful, but here's what it means. Instead of actually exploring all the anxiety and grief of 9/11, these novels basically work to suppress it. They take the tragedy and flip it into a story of triumphalism. Lots of patriotic flag waving or stories about religious conversion. The result is less about real mourning and more about making people feel reassured, almost using the attacks for a kind of propaganda. And then, in total contrast to that, we have the third category, imaginative engagement. And maybe its darkest, most challenging example is Don DeLillo's novel Falling Man. This book just refuses to give any easy answers, any sense of healing, or any of that triumphalism. It just stares right into the unhealed wound. DeLillo paints this incredibly bleak picture of life after the attacks. It's a world of drift, of mental paralysis. His characters are just hollowed out. Their personalities kind of disintegrated by the shadow of sadness that they just can't shake. In DeLillo's world, there is no redemption. There's no recovery. The trauma just gets reenacted over and over. And he does this by centering the whole novel on an image that the media very quickly tried to suppress, the falling man photograph by Richard Drew. By picking that symbol of irredeemable death, instead of, say, images of heroic first responders or waving flags, DeLillo creates this powerful counter-narrative. He forces you to confront the part of 9/11 that resists being turned into a heroic story, the raw, gut-wrenching horror of it all. So this contrast really shows the two main paths that authors in this third category could take. DeLillo's novel, it's a portrait of pure melancholia. The wound stays open, the trauma is on a loop, and you just can't move on. But other authors tried to explore the really difficult path of mourning. The process of working through the trauma, of trying to fit what happened into some kind of meaningful story, no matter how hard that might be. So while DeLillo showed us a world where language just breaks down, other authors did the exact opposite. They used the creative power of language, of artistic form itself, as tools for recovery. They tried to tell the tale as maybe the first step toward actually healing. And a perfect example here is Art Spiegelman's graphic novel In the Shadow of No Towers. Now, Spiegelman's perspective is it's incredibly unique. He was a direct witness to the towers falling, but he was also an indirect witness to the Holocaust because he's the one who recorded his father's stories for his masterpiece, Mouse. Spiegelman's approach is so fascinating because he sees one event through the lens of the other. For him, the trauma of 9/11 brought the secondary trauma of the Holocaust roaring back. But he doesn't just give in to pessimism. Instead, he balances collapse with resurgence. His own political awakening, his use of these complex, self-ironic artistic techniques, that becomes a huge part of his own healing process, his own working through.
To try and express something that feels, well, inexpressible, Spiegelman uses a technique called mimetic approximation. He uses every tool in his artistic toolbox, breaking up time, complex image sequences, not to give you a simple explanation, but to try and revive the feeling of the trauma for the reader. It's his attempt to give voice to that deep, unspeakable rupture in his experience of space and time. Another really powerful example of this working through idea is Jonathan Safran Foer's novel. It dives right into the connection between immense pain and how impossible it feels to put that pain into words. All the characters are victims of some historical disaster, and they're all, in their own way, silenced by it. And in this book, the way it looks on the page actually mirrors what it's about. Foer uses what one critic called pyrotechnic visual devices. We're talking photographs, totally blank pages, ciphers, distorted text. And these aren't just gimmicks. They're there to show you how hard it is to communicate extreme trauma. As the reader, you actually experience the character's struggle with language. So ultimately, the whole novel is a quest. It's about a young boy, Oscar, who's trying to come to grips with his father's death in the World Trade Center. And his journey is really an attempt to reopen these blocked channels of communication in his family. Just by speaking, by searching, he's trying to make reality fluid again, trying to stop the shock from hardening into this chronic silent pain. Okay, this brings us to the final and maybe the most difficult moral and artistic question that novelists had to face after 9/11. What do you do about the perpetrators? I mean, how, if at all, do you write about the terrorists themselves? Well, a handful of really prominent authors actually dared to take on that very challenge. Writers like Martin Amis, Michael Cunningham, and John Updike. They attempted what seemed almost unthinkable, to imaginatively get inside the mindset of a terrorist. It was a very deliberate effort to escape that simple binary us versus them thinking. This approach really highlights something that literature can do that almost nothing else can. While law and politics have to box terrorism into a dialectic of crime and punishment, fiction can create a different kind of space. These authors explored the tension between the terrorist as a legal concept and the terrorist as a complex, human, imaginative construct. And that search for complexity, it's the polar opposite of both the terrorist's rigid worldview and the counter-terrorist's call for simple revenge. And that leaves us with the profound question that these novelists force us to confront. How do you explore the roots of such horrendous violence without for 1 second condoning it? How do you practice empathy and imagination in the face of those who want to destroy it? That is the central artistic and moral dilemma that the fiction of 9/11 leaves us all to think about.